Alone in the wilds, she didn't expect kindness. The wind, a raw, scraping sound across the skeletal branches of the pines, was Ilara's only constant companion. It had been her companion since the men of Blackwood Ridge, their faces grim and set in judgment, had pointed her towards the shadowed pass and told her not to return. Her husband, Thomas, lay cold in the churchyard, victim of a fever that had swept through their small homestead like a vengeful spirit. With him gone, Ilara, childless and now widow, had become a loose thread in the tight weave of their community, a burden they were quick to snip, go. Elder Hemsworth had said, his voice devoid of pity, "Find your own way. The ridge has mouths enough to feed." Her own way. The words had echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart as she'd stumbled through the pass, a meager sack on her back containing a few dried provisions, a tinderbox, a knife Thomas had prized, and the threadbare blanket from their marriage bed. The mountains rose around her, indifferent giants of stone and ice, their peaks lost in the gray, churning sky. Each step was a victory against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. Heat pressed down during the day, a suffocating blanket, only to give way to a biting chill as soon as the sun bled out behind the western crags. Her eyes, once bright with a quiet joy, were now often hollow, shadowed by exhaustion and the gnawing ache of loss. Days bled into a week, then two. The sparse provisions dwindled. She followed game trails, her ears straining for the sound of water, her gaze sweeping the undergrowth for anything edible. Berries, often bitter and tough roots, became her sustenance. Sleep was a fitful, anxious state, punctuated by the snap of a twig, the distant howl of a wolf, the imagined sound of footsteps. Then she found it. Tucked into a small, relatively sheltered basin, where a narrow creek chuckled over smooth stones, stood a cabin. It was more a ruin than a dwelling. The roof sagged precariously in one corner, a gaping wound exposing the interior to the elements. One window was a dark, vacant eye. The other still held a few shards of murky glass. The door hung by a single rusted hinge, groaning with every push of the wind, but it was shelter. Walls, however dilapidated, against the vast, uncaring wilderness. The air inside was thick with the scent of old smoke, damp earth, and animal musk. Pack rat leavings littered the single room, and cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from the low rafters. But there was a hearth, a crude stone fireplace, and the ghost of a chimney. Hope, a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, flickered in Ilara's chest. The first few days were a blur of relentless labor. She cleared the debris, her hands raw and aching. She used Thomas's knife to hack away at encroaching brush, her arms burning with the unaccustomed strain. She found flat stones by the creek and, with painstaking effort, began to patch the worst of the holes in the roof, her fingers clumsy, her progress agonizingly slow. The nights were still cold. The wind still moaned through the gaps in the chinking. But the thin walls offered a psychological barrier against the vast emptiness outside. She learned the language of the wilderness, the frantic chatter of squirrels, a warning of a predator, the shift in the wind a herald of changing weather. Loneliness was a constant ache, a physical presence that sat beside her as she gnawed on a charred, half-cooked rabbit snared with a clumsy trap of her own devising. She talked to the crackling fire, to the memory of Thomas, to the silent, watchful trees. Her inner thoughts, once a jumble of grief and fear, began to settle into a grim determination. She would survive. She had to. There was nothing else. One chill morning, as a pale sun struggled to pierce the mist clinging to the basin, Ilara emerged from the cabin, a wooden bucket in hand, heading for the creek. She froze. Not 20 yards away by the tree line stood a man, He was tall, clad in buckskins darkened with age and wear, a long rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. A thick, unkempt beard, shot with gray, covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, beneath the brim of a battered hat, were like chips of winter ice. He made no move, simply watched her. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Ilara. This was his territory, she realized. The cabin, perhaps, was his. She clutched the bucket handle, her knuckles white. Her mind raced. Apologize, flee, pled. The man remained silent, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't overtly threatening, but it was intensely scrutinizing, like a hawk assessing prey. He was an embodiment of the wilderness itself, rugged, unyielding, and utterly indifferent to her plight. "This your place?" Ilara finally managed, her voice raspy from disuse. He considered her for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them, then a curt, almost imperceptible shake of his head. His voice, when it came, was as rough as granite, was, long ago. He shifted his weight, the rifle still casual in his grip. "You ain't from around here." It wasn't a question. "No," she admitted, her chin lifting slightly. "Blackwood Ridge." She saw no flicker of recognition, or if there was, his expression didn't betray it. "They run you out?" he asked, his tone flat. A flush of old shame and anger warmed her cheeks. "My husband died. I was no longer welcome." His eyes didn't soften, they merely observed. "This is hard country for a lone woman." "I'm aware," Ilara said, a spark of defiance in her tone. She would not beg. She had been cast out once. She would not offer herself up for it again. If he meant to drive her off, let him say it. He grunted, a non-committal sound. Then, without another word, he turned and melted back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. Ilara stood rooted, the bucket forgotten, her heart hammering. He hadn't told her to leave, but he hadn't offered welcome either. She was still alone, but now she was alone with the knowledge of another human nearby, a human as wild and unpredictable as the mountains themselves. The encounter left her unsettled, the fragile peace of her solitude fractured. Kindness? No, she hadn't expected it from the pious folk of Blackwood Ridge, and she certainly didn't expect it from a man who looked as if he'd been carved from the very rock and timber of this desolate land. Days passed. Ilara saw no further sign of the mountain man. She tried to push the encounter from her mind, focusing on the ceaseless tasks of survival. She improved her snares, managing to catch a couple more scrawny rabbits and a grouse. She gathered firewood, her axe strokes becoming surer, more economical. The patched roof held against a night of thin, sleety rain. Each small success was a bulwark against despair. She felt her body hardening, her senses sharpening. The soft woman from Blackwood Ridge was receding, replaced by someone leaner, tougher, more attuned to the harsh rhythms of the wild. Yet, the man's presence, or its memory, lingered at the edge of her awareness. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every unexpected shadow, made her start. Was he watching, judging her efforts, waiting for her to fail? One evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and grays, she returned from checking her snares, empty again, to find a freshly killed rabbit lying on the worn stoop of her cabin. It was cleaned, ready for the spit. There were no footprints other than her own, no sign of who had left it. Her heart lurched. The mountain man, it had to be. She stood for a long time, staring at the unexpected offering. Suspicion warred with a desperate gnawing hunger. Was it a test, a trick, or an act of disinterested charity? She couldn't fathom his motives. He owed her nothing. She had encroached on what was or had been his domain. Finally, hunger won. She cooked the rabbit over her small fire, the aroma filling the cramped cabin, a richness she hadn't experienced in weeks. As she ate, slowly, savoring each mouthful, she felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. The silence of the wilderness seemed different now, no longer entirely empty. It held a question mark, a silent observer. A few days later, she was struggling to fell a dead, dry pine for firewood. The tree was thicker than she'd anticipated, and the borrowed axe, though sharpened on a river stone, was still not ideal. Her swings were becoming ragged, her arms aching, sweat stung her eyes. She paused, leaning against the rough bark, frustration welling up. Angle your cuts more. Let the axe do the work. The voice, still rough but closer this time, startled her so badly she nearly dropped the axe. The mountain man stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning against a broad fir, arms crossed. He hadn't made a sound approaching. Ilara swallowed, her pride smarting, but the weariness in her muscles was a more potent force. Easier said than done, she retorted, though without real heat. He pushed himself off the tree and walked towards her. He didn't take the axe but pointed, here and here, not so wide, you're wasting energy. His instruction was blunt, devoid of pleasantry, but it was practical. She hesitated, then gripped the axe again, trying to follow his direction. Her next few swings felt marginally better. He watched, his expression unreadable. You'll need more than rabbit and roots come winter, he said, his gaze sweeping her meager setup. Snows come early in these mountains, deep. I know, she said quietly. The thought of winter was a cold dread that lived constantly in the pit of her stomach. He grunted. Creek will freeze over in places. Game will be harder to find. He paused. There's a way to smoke meat, if you've got enough to make it worthwhile. This, she sensed, was an opening, though of what kind she couldn't tell. I've never smoked meat, she admitted. He looked at her then, a long, considering look. His eyes, she noticed, were not so much icy as they were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a deep, unsettling gray. Name's Silas, he said abruptly. Ilara, she replied, surprised by the introduction. He nodded, a curt dip of his chin. River to the west, 'bout half a day's walk, has fish, if you can catch 'em. He turned as if to leave. Silas, she called, a sudden impulse. He stopped, glanced back. The rabbit. Thank you. He gave another of his non-committal grunts, waste to let it go to the coyotes. Then he was gone, vanishing into the trees as silently as before. Ilara stared after him, the axe heavy in her hand. A name. He had a name, and he had offered, not help, exactly, more like crumbs of information, dropped as if by accident. It wasn't kindness as she had ever known it, the soft-voiced, smiling kindness of women sharing recipes, or men offering a helping hand with a heavy load. This was something else, something as stark and unadorned as the landscape itself. And yet, for the first time since Blackwood Ridge, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of warmth began to sprout in the frozen soil of her heart. He hadn't driven her away. He had spoken to her. He had told her his name. In this vast, lonely wilderness, these small things felt monumental. The encounters with Silas became infrequent, unpredictable, but they continued. He never stayed long, never entered her cabin. Sometimes he would appear while she was fishing with a crude line and hook she'd fashioned, offering a gruff suggestion about bait. Once, he showed her how to identify a patch of late autumn mushrooms that were safe to eat, his calloused finger pointing out the subtle differences between them and their poisonous look-alikes. He taught her to read the subtler signs of the weather, the way the clouds gathered over distant peaks, the behavior of the birds. Each piece of knowledge was a lifeline. Alara absorbed it all, her mind keen, her gratitude unspoken but profound. She, in turn, found small ways to reciprocate, though she wasn't sure he even noticed. When she managed to patch a tear in her own worn shirt with surprising neatness, she left a small, neatly mended game bag she'd crafted from a piece of spare hide near a trail she knew he used. It was gone the next day. No comment was ever made. The days shortened. A bone-deep chill began to permeate the air. The leaves of the aspens turned a brilliant, fleeting gold, then rained down, carpeting the forest floor. Ilara worked tirelessly, banking earth against the cabin walls for insulation, gathering every scrap of firewood she could find. Fear of the coming winter was a constant spur. One afternoon, a sudden blizzard swept down from the high peaks, a maelstrom of blinding snow and howling wind that caught Ilara away from the cabin, checking her trapline. Disoriented, she stumbled, the familiar landmarks vanishing in the white fury. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise. She was inadequately dressed for this, her thin cloak offering little protection. Just as she was starting to truly fear she would wander lost until she collapsed, a dark shape loomed out of the swirling snow. Silas. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "Foolish to be out in this," he growled, his voice barely audible above the wind's roar. He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and began to pull her along. He seemed to navigate by instinct, his steps sure even where she could see nothing. The wind tore at them, ice particles stinging her exposed skin. She stumbled, and he hauled her upright without breaking stride. It felt like an eternity before the dim outline of her cabin appeared through the white curtain. He shoved the door open. She'd managed to rehang it, after a fashion, and pushed her inside. The small space was freezing, the fire long dead. Ilara sank onto her pallet of pine boughs, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Silas didn't hesitate. He went to her meager woodpile, quickly laying a fire in the hearth, his movements efficient, practiced. Soon flames licked at the kindling, then caught the larger pieces, casting a flickering, welcome light. The oppressive roar of the wind outside seemed to lessen, muted by the cabin walls and the growing crackle of the fire. He found her blanket and threw it over her, then rummaged in his own pack, producing a small tin of tea leaves and a battered pot. He set water from her bucket to heat by the fire. Ilara watched him, still shivering, a profound sense of exhaustion washing over her. He moved with a quiet competence, a man utterly at home in harsh conditions. He hadn't asked permission, he had simply done what was necessary. When the tea was brewed, strong and hot, he poured some into her only cup and handed it to her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. He said nothing, just watched as she sipped the scalding liquid, feeling its warmth spread through her chilled limbs. "The trap," she mumbled, her lips numb. "I left a rabbit in it." "It'll keep till the storm passes," he said, "if a wolf doesn't find it first." The silence settled between them again, broken only by the hiss and pop of the fire and the relentless shriek of the wind outside. It was a different kind of silence now, shared within the small, fire-lit space. Not comfortable, perhaps, but not entirely uncomfortable either. It was a silence born of necessity, of a shared battle against the elements. "You would have frozen," he stated, not unkindly, but as a matter of fact. Ilara nodded, unable to dispute it. "Thank you, Silas." Her voice was small. "You saved my life." He grunted, staring into the flames. No sense in two fools freezing when one can prevent it. After a moment he added, "This cabin, it needs better chinking. Wind cuts right through." "I know," she said. I've been trying. The blizzard raged for 2 days. Silas stayed. There was nowhere else for him to go, and Ilara knew, without him saying it, that he wouldn't have left her alone until the worst was over. They spoke little. He showed her how to whittle a figure-4 trap trigger, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. She, in turn, took the opportunity of his enforced presence to ask more questions about winter survival, where to find sheltered spots for snares when the snow was deep, how to tell if ice was thick enough to cross. He answered in his usual terse way, but he answered. When the storm finally broke, revealing a world transformed, blanketed in a pristine, glittering white, Silas prepared to leave. The air was bitingly cold but still. "Need to check my own place," he said, shrugging into his heavy outer coat. Ilara stood by the door. "Silas," she began, wanting to express the depth of her gratitude, but words failed her. "How did you thank someone for your life, for a shared sanctuary against a killing storm, when words felt so inadequate?" He seemed to understand. He paused, his hand on the crude door latch. "You're tougher than you look, woman," he said, and it was, for him, a profound compliment. "But this winter will test you." He glanced around the small cabin, his gaze lingering for a moment on the newly organized woodpile, the neatly stacked cooking stones. "You'll manage." And then he was gone, leaving Ilara alone once more, but not as alone as before. The cabin felt different now, warmer, not just from the lingering fire, but from the residue of shared experience. He believed she would manage, and because he believed it, she found herself believing it a little more too. The kindness she hadn't expected had come not in soft words or gentle gestures, but in shared hardship, practical knowledge, and a gruff, unspoken respect. It was a currency of the wilderness, hard-earned and deeply valued. The deep winter settled in, a long, brutal siege. The snow piled high, burying the landscape under a vast white silence. Ilara's days became a cycle of tending her trapline, moved to more sheltered spots as Silas had advised, gathering firewood and ensuring her small fire never went out. The isolation was profound, the silence broken only by the wind, the crackle of flames, or the distant cry of a wolf. But now, a thread of connection, however tenuous, linked her to another soul in this vast emptiness. Sometimes, from a high ridge, she would see a thin plume of smoke rising from the direction she presumed Silas's cabin lay. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. One particularly bitter morning, she found large, distinct boot prints in the snow near her woodpile, alongside a brace of plump ptarmigan, their winter feathers white as the drifts. No note, no sign of Silas himself, just the birds, a silent offering, a warmth spread through her that had little to do with the idea of a hot meal. She began to leave things for him, too, when she had a small surplus, a neatly darned woolen mitten she'd found discarded and repaired, a small cake of soap she'd managed to make from hoarded fat and wood ash. They were always gone when she next passed the discreet spot by an ancient, lightning-struck pine that had become their unspoken drop-off point. As the days began to lengthen, imperceptibly at first, a new threat emerged, not from the elements, but from mankind. One afternoon, while checking a snare line further down the valley than usual, closer to the rumored edges of a rough mining camp called Hard Scrabble, Ilara heard voices, harsh, male voices, and the jingle of harnesses. She melted into a thicket of snow-laden spruce, her heart pounding. 3 men on horseback rode into view. They were rough-looking, clad in greasy furs and stained wool, their faces hard and unshaven. One of them, a hulking man with a scar that puckered his left cheek, pointed towards the higher ground where her cabin and Silas's were hidden. "Heard tell there's an old trapper up that way, Jedediah," one of the men said. "Sits on good trapping ground, and maybe a squatter woman too, some crazy hermit." The man called Jedediah, clearly the leader, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "Good trapping ground is our ground, if we say it is, and anything else on it." He grinned, a humorless baring of stained teeth. "We'll pay 'em a visit when the thaw makes travel easier, see what they got worth taking." They rode on, their crude laughter echoing in the cold air. Ilara remained hidden, her blood running cold. They meant her, and Silas, worth taking. The words implied more than just furs or supplies. For a lone woman, they implied a danger that made the wilderness itself seem benign. She hurried back to her cabin, fear a cold knot in her stomach. Silas. She had to warn Silas. She didn't know exactly where his cabin was, only the general direction. She gathered her courage, strapped on the crude snowshoes Silas had helped her make, and set off, following the faint trace of smoke she'd often seen. It took her hours, pushing through deep drifts, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Just as dusk began to fall, painting the snow in shades of violet and gray, she found it, a cabin sturdier and better maintained than her own, nestled deep within a stand of old-growth pine. Smoke curled invitingly from its chimney. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly unsure. But the memory of Jedediah's cruel face spurred her on. She stepped forward, calling out, "Silas, Silas, it's Ilara." The door creaked open, and Silas stood framed in the dim light, his rifle in hand, his expression wary. It softened slightly when he saw her. "Ilara, what is it? You all right?" Breathless, she poured out her story, the men, their words, their intentions. He listened intently, his face growing grimmer with each detail. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Jedediah Meeks," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Knows him. He and his scum drift from camp to camp, preying on the weak. Thought they'd cleared out last fall." He looked at Ilara. "They won't be reasoned with." "What will we do?" she asked, the question hanging heavy in the cold air. Silas looked around his small, well-ordered clearing, then back at her. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a new intensity. "They come for one, they come for both. This is our place now." He straightened. "We'll be ready for them." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Silas, it turned out, was a man of formidable foresight and skill. He showed Ilara weak points in the approaches to both cabins, how to set deadfalls, where to create diversions. They stockpiled firewood and ammunition. Silas had a surprising amount of the latter. He taught her to load and fire his spare, older musket, her shoulder aching from the recoil, but her resolve hardening with each practice shot. There was a new dynamic between them, forged in the face of shared danger. The old hesitancy was gone, replaced by a quiet camaraderie, a mutual reliance. They worked together, ate together, sometimes by her fire, sometimes by his. The silences were easier now, filled with unspoken understanding. One evening as they sat by Ilara's hearth, sharing a stew made from one of the ptarmigans Silas had provided and roots Ilara had carefully stored, she found herself speaking of Thomas, of Blackwood Ridge, of the loneliness that had almost consumed her. Silas listened, his gaze on the fire, offering no empty platitudes, just a steady, quiet presence that was more comforting than any words could have been. Then he spoke of his own past, brief, stark sentences about a wife and child lost to sickness years ago, the reason he'd sought the solitude of the mountains. "Thought I was done with people," he said, his voice rough with old pain. He looked at Ilara then, a direct, searching gaze. "Reckon I was wrong." The words, simple as they were, resonated deep within Ilara. She wasn't just a burden, a stray. She was part of something again, something fragile perhaps, but real. The thaw came slowly, then with a rush. The snow receded, the creek roared with meltwater, and the first green shoots of spring began to appear. And with the passable trails came Jedediah Meeks and his men. They came at dawn, 5 of them, thinking to catch their victims unprepared. But Silas and Ilara were waiting. Silas had positioned himself in the rocks above his cabin, his long rifle ready. Ilara was concealed near her own, the old musket heavy but steady in her hands, a small pile of extra shot and powder beside her. Jedediah rode boldly into Silas's clearing, his men fanning out. "Silas, old man, we come to talk terms," he bellowed, a smirk on his face. "No terms with your kind, Meeks." Silas's voice boomed from the rocks, followed by the crack of his rifle. One of Meek's men cried out, clutching his shoulder, his horse rearing. Chaos erupted. Meeks roared orders, his men scrambling for cover, firing wildly. Ilara waited, her heart pounding, until one of them, trying to flank Silas, moved into her line of sight. She took a steadying breath, aimed as Silas had taught her, and fired. The musket kicked hard, and the man yelped, dropping his rifle as he clutched his leg. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Faced with determined, well-aimed resistance from 2 fronts, and with 2 of their number wounded, Meek's bravado crumbled. He cursed, gathered his injured men, and they retreated, a disorganized rabble, leaving threats and curses hanging in the crisp morning air. Silas and Ilara watched them go, neither speaking until they were out of sight. Then Silas climbed down from the rocks, his face grim but relieved. He walked over to Ilara, who was slowly reloading the musket, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. He put a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of physical contact. "You did good, Ilara, real good." She looked up at him, a small, shaky smile touching her lips. "We did good, Silas." They stood there for a moment, the scent of gunpowder sharp in the air, the sounds of the awakening forest around them. The threat was gone, at least for now. They had defended their small piece of the world, together. In the days that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the basin. The cabins, once symbols of solitary survival, now felt like 2 anchors of a shared existence. Silas helped Ilara properly repair her roof and strengthen her walls. She, in turn, brought a touch of order and comfort to his more Spartan dwelling, mending his clothes with a skill that surprised him, planting a small herb garden near his door. They didn't speak of love or of futures beyond the turning of the seasons, but the bond between them was as strong and resilient as the ancient pines that surrounded them. They had faced the wilderness, faced their own pasts, and faced a common enemy, and they had not only survived but had found something precious in the struggle, a companionship born of mutual respect, shared hardship, and the unexpected blossoming of kindness in the harshest of soils. One evening, sitting on the stoop of Ilara's cabin, watching the sun set in a blaze of glory behind the peaks, Silas spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Reckon this place ain't so empty anymore." Ilara leaned her head back against the rough-hewn logs, a quiet contentment filling her. No, it wasn't empty. She had come into the wilds expecting nothing but hardship, and she had found it. But she had also found her own strength, and she had found Silas, and that, she knew, was more than enough. The resilience of the human spirit, she mused, was a stubborn thing, capable of finding warmth even in the deepest winter, and kindness where none was expected. If Ilara's journey and the unexpected connections she forged in the face of adversity resonated with you, please consider liking this story, subscribing for more narratives of resilience, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What part of her story moved you the most? Never forget the strength that can be found in unexpected places and the courage it takes to build a new beginning.